Hey guys, and welcome back to the channel. Tonight we're going to dim the lights, settle into our coziest blankets, and drift back in time to one of the most bizarre and, frankly, unsettling moments in papal history. We're talking about a story so strange, so utterly devoid of common sense, that it sounds like something plucked from a particularly vivid, slightly feverish dream. So grab your favorite warm beverage, get comfortable, and let's gently unfurl the peculiar tale of the Cadaver Synod. Our story begins, as many good stories do, with a pope. But not just any pope. We need to set the stage with two specific pontiffs whose lives and one's afterlife would become intertwined in a most peculiar and gruesome fashion. First, let's talk about Pope Formosus. He was, by all accounts, a rather busy and politically active fellow. Before he even became pope, Formosus was the bishop of Porto and a legate, which is basically a fancy diplomatic envoy, to the Bulgarians. He was quite good at his job, apparently, even managing to convert Boris I of Bulgaria to Christianity, a pretty big win for the home team, as it were. Now, Formosus was a bit of a political chameleon, or at least he had a knack for finding himself in the thick of things. During the complicated political landscape of 9th century Italy, where various factions and emperors were constantly vying for power, Formosus found himself siding with Arnulf of Carinthia, a Holy Roman Emperor contender. This, of course, put him at odds with other powerful figures, including, eventually, a man who would become Pope John VIII. John VIII, bless his heart, wasn't exactly a fan of Formosus. There was some back and forth, some excommunications, some very dramatic pronouncements, all the usual papal drama of the era. Formosus was even accused of trying to become the Archbishop of Bulgaria himself, which was a big no-no because at the time, a bishop wasn't supposed to just up and leave his current see to take another. It was considered a sort of spiritual bigamy, and the church, then as now, had a rather strong stance against bigamy. So Formosus was excommunicated, then reinstated, then excommunicated again. It was a whole thing. Eventually, Formosus did become pope in 881 AD, and for a few years, things seemed to settle down. He crowned Arnulf of Carinthia as Holy Roman Emperor, which was a strong political statement, and generally carried on with the business of being the head of the Western Church. He died in 896 AD, seemingly peacefully enough, after 5 years as pope. One might think that would be the end of Formosus's story. One would be wrong, so very, very wrong. Because this is where our second pope enters the scene, a rather less fortunate character named Pope Stephen VI. Stephen VI, who became pope in 896, the very same year Formosus died, had a particular axe to grind with the deceased pontiff. Now, the reasons for Stephen's intense animosity towards Formosus are a bit murky, but they likely stemmed from the complex and vicious factional politics of the time. Remember those various powerful families and emperors? Well, Formosus had aligned himself with certain groups, and Stephen VI was firmly in the opposing camp, specifically the powerful Spoleto faction. The Spoleto family, and particularly their matriarch Agiltrude, had a bone to pick with Formosus. Formosus had crowned Arnulf of Carinthia, who was a rival to Lambert of Spoleto, Agiltrude's son, for the imperial crown. So, when Stephen VI, who was essentially a puppet of the Spoleto faction, ascended to the papacy, it was clear that Formosus's legacy, and perhaps even his physical remains, were in for a rough ride. Agiltrude, it seems, was not one to let a grudge die with the person who incurred it. In fact, she seems to have been instrumental in pushing Stephen VI to take the extraordinary and, quite frankly, insane step that he did. Less than a year after Formosus's death, Pope Stephen VI decided that the man needed to stand trial, not just a posthumous trial where his reputation was debated, mind you. Oh no, that would be far too conventional. Stephen VI decided that Formosus himself, or at least what was left of him, needed to be physically present in court. And so, in January of 897 AD, the Cadaver Synod took place. The very name sends a shiver down one's spine, doesn't it? Cadaver Synod. It just rolls off the tongue like a cursed incantation. The body of Pope Formosus was exhumed after being dead for about 9 months. Now imagine that for a moment. 9 months in a tomb in the 9th century. We're not talking about a pristine, perfectly preserved mummy here. No, we're talking about a corpse that had undoubtedly seen better days, a rather ripe cadaver, shall we say. This decaying body was then dressed in papal vestments and propped up on a throne in the Basilica of St. John Lateran, the very seat of papal power. A deacon was assigned to stand next to the corpse, tasked with answering on behalf of the deceased pope. Just picture the scene. Stephen VI, seated in judgment, a room full of bewildered, possibly nauseated bishops and clergy, and in the center, a reanimated, in the legal sense at least, corpse, silent and certainly not offering any eloquent defense. The charges against Formosus were essentially the old ones, that he had illegally transferred from his bishopric of Porto to Rome, violating canon law, and that he had been an oath-breaker. The trial was, predictably, a farce. Stephen VI railed against the silent defendant, accusing him of ambition and avarice. The deacon, no doubt sweating profusely and trying desperately not to gag, meekly attempted to present a defense, but it was all for naught. The verdict was predetermined. Formosus was found guilty. His papacy was retroactively declared null and void. All his acts and ordinations were invalidated. This was a particularly devastating blow, as it meant that all the bishops, priests, and deacons Formosus had ordained were suddenly, officially, no longer legitimate. Chaos, as you can imagine, ensued among the clergy who had been ordained by Formosus. It was a legal and spiritual nightmare, a bureaucratic tangle of epic proportions, all stemming from this utterly deranged trial. But the humiliation of Formosus did not end there. Oh no, the Cadaver Synod was just getting started with its macabre proceedings. After the verdict, the 3 fingers of Formosus's right hand, the very fingers he had used for blessings, were cut off, a symbolic dismemberment meant to signify the stripping of his sacred authority. Then his body was stripped of papal vestments, clad in ordinary burial clothes, and dragged through the streets of Rome. The ultimate indignity came next. The desecrated corpse of Formosus was thrown into the Tiber River. Because why not? If you're going to go to all the trouble of exhumating a body, putting it on trial, and mutilating it, you might as well finish the job with a dramatic aquatic disposal. The Tiber, flowing silently through Rome, became the final, temporary resting place for a pope who couldn't catch a break even in death. This whole spectacle, as you can imagine, did not go down well with everyone. Even in the 9th century, people had a fairly good grasp of what constituted normal, and putting a dead guy on trial definitely fell outside that purview. Many Romans were appalled, viewing the Cadaver Synod as a profound act of sacrilege and an insult to the dignity of the papacy itself. It was widely seen as an act of extreme vindictiveness, driven more by political vendetta than any genuine theological or canonical concern. The sheer audacity, the grotesqueness of it all was too much for many, and, as is often the case with such extreme acts, karma, or perhaps just the tide of public opinion, had a way of swinging back. Stephen VI's papacy, after the Cadaver Synod, was marked by increasing unpopularity and political instability. His actions had alienated a significant portion of the Roman populace and clergy. The blatant disrespect shown to a deceased pontiff, regardless of his past political affiliations, was a step too far. Let's float over to another royal disaster, or rather another papal disaster that directly resulted from this one. The story of Stephen VI himself takes a rather grim turn. His extreme actions and the sheer madness of the Cadaver Synod ultimately led to his downfall. Just months after the trial, public outrage reached a fever pitch. He was imprisoned and then rather unceremoniously strangled to death. Some say it was an act of mob justice. Others claim it was a political assassination orchestrated by those who opposed the Spoleto faction and were disgusted by the treatment of Formosus. Either way, Stephen VI met a rather ignominious end, a stark reminder that even popes, especially the particularly vindictive ones, could not always escape the consequences of their actions. But wait, there's more to Formosus's post-mortem adventures. His story isn't quite finished yet. The body of Formosus, after being tossed into the Tiber, was eventually recovered. Legend has it that a hermit, or perhaps just a very dedicated fisherman, found the body washed ashore and gave it a proper burial. This quiet act of reverence, however, was not the final chapter. The tides of papal politics continued to churn. Within a year, the papacy changed hands again. Romanus became pope for a few months, and then Theodore II took.
Let's float over to France, specifically to the glittering, gilded halls of Versailles. Now, Louis XIV, the Sun King, is usually remembered for his spectacular fashion, his massive wigs, and for being the absolute blueprint of a powerful monarch. He famously said, "L'État c'est moi. I am the state," and for 72 years, he really was. But if we peel back the velvet curtains and look past the gold leaf, Louis XIV's daily life was a masterclass in high-stakes weirdness and a very public struggle with his own digestive system. You see, being the Sun King meant you never did anything alone, not even the things you really should do alone. Louis turned his entire life into a performance. There was the lever, the rising ceremony, and the coucher, the bedding ceremony. Dozens of nobles would crowd into his bedroom just to watch him wake up, wash his face with a damp cloth, and put on his breeches. It was considered a high honor to hold the king's sleeve. Imagine that being the peak of your professional career, holding a damp shirt for a man who hasn't brushed his teeth yet. But the most fascinating and arguably most relatable part of Louis's life was his stomach. Louis XIV had an appetite that was, quite frankly, terrifying. He could consume multiple courses of pheasant, mutton, ham, and fruit in a single sitting, washed down with copious amounts of wine. Because he was the king, no one could tell him to slow down or maybe eat a salad. The result of this lifelong banquet was a digestive tract that was essentially in a state of permanent rebellion. In his later years, Louis suffered from a very painful, very undignified ailment, an anal fistula. Today, this is a relatively straightforward medical fix. In 1686, it was a national crisis. The king's health was the state's health. His royal surgeons, who were well-meaning but lacked what we might call basic hygiene, decided the only way to fix the Sun King was through a brand new surgical procedure. They actually practiced on several peasants first, none of whom survived, by the way, before finally taking a custom-made serrated silver knife to the king. Surprisingly, Louis survived. He sat through the entire ordeal without a single scream, because screaming wasn't very Sun King of him. It became a trend in Versailles afterward. Nobles would actually fake having the same ailment just to be like the king. It's a strange kind of devotion, isn't it, to want the same medical disasters as your ruler just to stay in fashion. While Louis was busy turning his physical suffering into a trend, let's drift eastward toward Bavaria to look at a king who took the concept of living in a fantasy to its logical and very expensive conclusion. We're talking about Ludwig II of Bavaria, often called the fairy tale king, or more unkindly, Mad King Ludwig. Ludwig was a product of the Wittelsbach line, a family that had its own fair share of eccentricities. Ludwig wasn't interested in the boring bits of being a king, like politics or war or balancing a budget. No, Ludwig wanted to live in the operas of Richard Wagner. He was obsessed with the Middle Ages, with knights, and with romantic legends. Instead of building barracks or schools, Ludwig spent the entire Bavarian national treasury building castles that looked like they belonged on the back of a cereal box. Neuschwanstein is the most famous one, the inspiration for the Disney castle. It's beautiful, perched on a rugged cliff, but it was also a monument to a man who was desperately trying to escape reality. Ludwig became increasingly reclusive. He hated Munich. He hated the crowds. He started sleeping during the day and wandering his castles at night. He would have elaborate dinners served for imaginary guests like Marie Antoinette or Louis XIV, chatting away to empty chairs while his servants stood by, probably wondering if they should intervene. He even had a disappearing table built into one of his dining rooms, a mechanical floor that lowered the table into the kitchen so he wouldn't have to see the servants at all, just a man, a roast duck, and his ghosts. Eventually, the Bavarian government decided that building castles for ghosts was not a sustainable fiscal policy. They sent a commission of doctors to declare him insane. The funny thing is, the doctors never actually examined him. They just interviewed his disgruntled servants and decided, yeah, he's definitely gone. They deposed him in 1886. A few days later, Ludwig was found dead in Lake Starnberg, along with the doctor who had diagnosed him. To this day, no one knows exactly what happened. Was it a suicide and escape attempt gone wrong? Or did the government decide a dead king was easier to manage than a mad one? It's a quiet, tragic end for a man who just wanted to live in a song. Let's float over to another royal disaster, this time in the cold, vast expanses of Russia. We've talked about the later Romanovs, but let's go back to the man who started the modern Russia, Peter the Great. Peter was a giant, literally. He was about 6 feet 8 tall in a time when the average man was 5'5". He was a force of nature, but he was also deeply weird. Peter had a fascination with anything mechanical, medical, or anatomical. He was the kind of person who would carry a set of dental tools with him and offered to pull the teeth of any courtier who complained of a literal ache. Since he was the Tsar, you couldn't really say no. Oh, your molar hurts? Let the emperor of all the Russias dig around in there with some unwashed iron pliers. He allegedly had a collection of teeth he'd pulled, which is just the sort of hobby that makes you a hit at parties. But the most fascinating and arguably most relatable part of Peter's life was his Kunstkamera, Russia's first museum. It wasn't just art and coins. Peter was obsessed with monsters and biological oddities. He collected preserved specimens in jars, conjoined twins, two-headed animals, and various anatomical anomalies. He even ordered that any unusual births in the empire be sent to him in St. Petersburg. He wanted to understand the science of it, but he did it with a grim, relentless enthusiasm that made his court very, very uncomfortable. He even had a great embassy where he traveled through Europe in disguise, though it's hard to stay in disguise when you're a 6'8" Russian giant with a facial tic. He worked in shipyards, studied surgery, and once even spent a night in a room with a corpse just to prove he wasn't afraid of ghosts. Peter was a man who wanted to drag Russia into the future by its hair, and he didn't care how many teeth he had to pull to do it. However, his personal life was a wreck. He couldn't stand his eldest son, Alexei. He thought Alexei was weak, lazy, and too religious. Eventually, the tension between father and son became so great that Alexei fled to Austria. Peter, ever the micromanager, tricked him into coming back, then had him arrested for treason. Alexei died in prison after being tortured, likely under his father's orders. It's a stark, cold reminder that in the world of absolute monarchs, family loyalty often came a very distant second to the stability of the throne. Speaking of family loyalty, let's drift back to the British Isles for a moment and look at the early Hanoverians. We've talked about George III's madness, but the family dynamics leading up to him were a special kind of toxic. George I and George II hated their heirs with a passion that was almost impressive. George I actually imprisoned his own wife, Sophia Dorothea of Celle, in a castle for 32 years because she had an affair. He never let her see her children again. Naturally, his son, the future George II, grew up hating his father. When George II became king, he carried on the tradition by loathing his own son, Frederick, Prince of Wales. The animosity was so high that when Frederick's wife went into labor, Frederick literally bundled her into a carriage in the middle of the night and drove her to a different palace, just so the king and queen wouldn't be present for the birth. The king called Frederick a monster and a nauseous little beast. It's almost a relief when Frederick died young from a burst abscess in his lung, reportedly caused by being hit by a cricket ball. It's a very British way for a family feud to end. A game of cricket and a tragic, sudden silence. These stories, from the Sun King's surgeries to Peter's jars of teeth, remind us that the people who wore the crowns were often just as broken, obsessed, and peculiar as anyone else. They just had a much larger budget for their eccentricities. As we close this chapter of our late-night journey, let the image of Ludwig's empty fairy tale castles and Peter's giant footsteps fade away. We're going to pause here, let the silence of history settle back in, and prepare to move on to our next set of royal disasters.
In the modern world, we tend to think of childhood as a time of play and protected growth. But for a royal child in the Middle Ages or the Renaissance, childhood was essentially a high-stakes internship for a job that might kill you. From the moment a royal baby was born, they weren't just a person, they were a diplomatic asset. They were a walking treaty, a living insurance policy, and a biological vessel for a family name that was usually far more important than their actual well-being. Let's float over to Spain again, because the Spanish court really did turn the misery of royal childhood into a fine art. Think of the famous painting Las Meninas by Velázquez. You see the little Infanta Marguerite Teresa in her enormous stiff dress. She looks like a doll, which is fitting because that's exactly how she was treated. She was the daughter of Philip IV, yes, our Habsburg friends again, and she was married off to her uncle, the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I, when she was just 15. But before she even got to the marriage, her life was a series of restrictions. Royal children were often surrounded by a literal army of servants, but they were rarely allowed to actually play. They were weighed down with clothes that were miniature versions of adult formal wear, stiff corsets, heavy velvets, and high collars that made it nearly impossible to move like a normal kid. And then there was the food. In an effort to keep these precious heirs alive, royal doctors often came up with the most counterproductive diets imaginable. They were fed strengthening broths that were mostly grease, or forbidden from eating fresh fruit because it was thought to cause fevers. If a royal child fell ill, the solution was almost always to bleed them. Imagine being a 5-year-old with a cold, and the most prestigious doctors in the country show up with leeches and lancets. It's a miracle any of them made it to puberty. Let's look at a particularly tragic example, the Dauphin Louis Charles, the son of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. When the French Revolution broke out, this poor child was thrust into a nightmare that no amount of royal protocol could have prepared him for. After his father was guillotined, the revolutionaries decided that the best way to handle an 8-year-old king in exile was to break him. They took him away from his mother and put him in the care of a cobbler named Antoine Simon. The goal was to re-educate him, to turn the King of France into a good little citizen. But the reality was much darker. He was kept in a dark, filthy room in the Temple prison. He was neglected, underfed, and reportedly encouraged to drink heavily and sing revolutionary songs. He died at the age of 10, likely from tuberculosis exacerbated by extreme neglect. It's one of the few stories in history that is almost too heavy for a sleepy monologue, but it serves as a stark contrast to the gilded cages we usually imagine. Let's float over to a slightly more surreal version of royal childhood, back in England with the boy king, Edward VI. Now, Edward was intellectually a prodigy. By the time he was 7, he was learning Latin, Greek, and French. He was a solemn, serious little boy who took his role as the head of the Church of England very seriously. But because he was the only male heir to the Tudor throne, he was treated with a level of paranoia that was stifling. He wasn't allowed to play with other children unless they were carefully vetted whipping boys. You've probably heard that term. The idea was that since the king's body was sacred, you couldn't hit him if he misbehaved. So if Edward messed up his Latin verbs, his whipping boy would get the punishment instead. It was meant to make the king feel guilty enough to behave, but it mostly just created a very strange, isolated social environment. Edward's life was a constant cycle of being examined by doctors and being moved from one palace to another to avoid the sweating sickness or the plague. He lived in a bubble of luxury and fear, only to die before he could ever truly rule. It's a recurring theme in these royal houses. The more precious the child, the less of a life they actually got to live. Because why not double down on the weirdness, let's look at how these children were prepared for marriage. It wasn't uncommon for royal toddlers to be engaged. They would have proxy weddings where a grown man would stand in for the groom, and the 2-year-old bride would be toddled through a ceremony. They were sent away to foreign courts at age 8 or 9 to learn the language of their future husband. Imagine being a 9-year-old girl taken from your home, sent to a country where you don't speak the language, and being told that the entire future of your family's alliance rests on your ability to produce an heir in a few years. It's no wonder so many of these queens developed melancholy or became intensely religious. It was the only escape they had. Let's drift towards the end of the 19th century, where things got a bit more modern but no less dysfunctional. The children of Queen Victoria were spread out across Europe like a grand genetic web. We've mentioned the hemophilia, but there was also the Prussian style of parenting. Victoria's eldest daughter, Vicky, married the future Emperor of Germany. Her son was Wilhelm I, the Kaiser of World War I. Wilhelm was born with a withered left arm due to a traumatic birth. In the hyper-masculine, military-obsessed Prussian court, this was seen as a disaster. His childhood was a grueling attempt to fix him. He was subjected to horrific treatments. His arm was strapped into a machine that tried to stretch it, and he was forced to ride a horse for hours, despite his lack of balance, falling off over and over while his tutors watched. This constant struggle to prove he wasn't weak likely contributed to the aggressive, blustering personality he developed as an adult, a personality that would eventually tip Europe into a world war. It's a strange thought, isn't it, that a difficult birth and a withered arm in 1850s could have such a direct line to the trenches of 1914. But that's the thing about royal history. The personal is always political, and the nursery is often where the future of the world is decided. Let's gently close the door on the royal nursery now. The echoes of Tudors and the rustle of stiff silk are fading away. We've seen the heavy crowns and the even heavier expectations placed on those who were far too small to carry them. As we drift towards the conclusion of tonight's journey, the world feels very still. The figures of the past, the dead popes, the inbred kings, the lonely children, are all resting now. Their dramas are over, their feuds are settled, and the silence of the centuries has smoothed over their mistakes. I'll leave you here in the quiet as we prepare for our final transition.